Welcome back to the Everlasting Man Book Club. We are here at the I'm here from Notre Dame. That's why I'm in a study room, so ignore the fluorescent lights. We are going to be discussing Chapter 5, Man in Mythologies, with Tom Ruby and Alan Cornett. So glad that you're here. I see people here from Alexandria, Virginia. I see people here from Green Bay, all across the country. I'm so glad that you're here. And I wanted to start with a brief introduction. I know we're having a little bit of trouble getting Alan patched in here, but Tom, I want you to tell me a little bit about yourself. Our icebreaker question for today is for everybody, and it's going to be, what is your favorite myth and why? So what is your favorite myth and why? I had to come all the way to Indiana to avoid tornadoes. So that is why I'm here, because I'm dedicated to the mission. I came to the study room just for you. So Tom, I want you to tell me a little bit about yourself. I know you and Alan just came back from Italy on a beautiful, I was following you on Twitter the entire time, trying not to covet or envy or any of that. It was really hard. So thanks for all of the fodder for my confession. And I'm so glad you're back, and I'm so glad you could join us. So take it away.
Thanks, Susan.
Okay.
I'm a Chestertonian because of this book.
Yeah.
I'm a Chestertonian because Chesterton brought me brought me here, and long before I knew that I was Catholic. I mean, he was working on me. But this book was the first book that I ever read aside from school that I marked up. After reading the first chapter, I said to Laura, "Hey, I got to go to the drugstore," and she says, "Okay, for what?" I said, "Highlighter." And so I still have my old highlighted copy. And I'm really, really glad that we could do this together. I love you guys a lot. And I'm really glad that we're going to talk about this chapter together. My favorite myth has to do with fairies and sprites and pixies, especially in the woods and around creeks and the water. I've been many times where the creeks meet at our farm here, up in the mountains, standing in moving waters, fly fishing, and you can hear voices in the water. And it's this chapter has some really good words about that. You can see how people at some time tried to make sense of that. Okay, I hear voices. Maybe there's something on another level. Maybe we're in a thin space between Earth and another reality. Maybe there are entities that are out there talking that we just can't understand. And I feel that presence. I think that our farm is protected by angels. We call it Angel Hill Farm. And I think that those entities are real, and that we understand them at a different level than other people did, maybe at a different time. So that's my intro and my favorite myth.
Beautiful. I love it. I love that, because myths are oftentimes about how people interpreted nature and phenomenon they completely understand. So that's a perfect example. So Alan Cornett, Tom's partner in crime. I would love for you to tell me a little bit more about yourself. Tell our audience a little bit more about yourself. You are also an avid Chestertonian, and then you got to share your favorite myth.
Well, not a whole lot to tell, really. I'm a Kentuckian, live in Lexington, Kentucky, surrounded by distilleries and horse farms. So that's was born and raised in Kentucky, so Kentuckian through and through. And I have a podcast called Cultural Debris that sometimes gets released and people listen to. So that's good. And Tom and I go on trips as well, which is nice. And my favorite myth, I will start by saying that as a young reader in my younger days, I loved myths and read books, these simplified stories of the Greek myths and all of that. But probably my favorite myths are the Arthurian legends. Loved King Arthur and the Round Table, and was always trying to find new expressions of those, adaptations, and watch movies and cartoons and whatever I could find when I was a kid. But, beyond that, I just always loved those great mythic stories, whatever they were. I would read, American folk tales, Pecos Bill and Paul Bunyan. Those are really myths. They're archetypal representations of mystery and explanations and trying to find things. And of course now, and Dale even alludes to this in his notes in this chapter. Comic books are really sort of modern myths. He talks about Thor being a hero and being adapted, but I loved reading Superman and Batman and so forth. Those are myths for,
Absolutely.
As a youngster, 20th century people, I guess now it's 21st century. I come from the last century. So.
I know, me too. Never mind all that.
Correct. But all of that, I will say, I'll embrace the Arthurian stories as my official answer on favorite legends.
That's a great one. And of course, Chesterton has so much to say about chivalry and has so much to say about what it is to be a man and what it is to be a woman. And, those tap into those very innate parts of humanity. So, all right, Joe, you're not getting away without an answer. So you got to let me know. What is your favorite myth?
Oh boy. I think the first one that I ever really fell in love with was Gawain and the Green Knight. Reading that in it was not Tolkien's translation. Came to that later, but I remember really enjoying that in high school. Probably one of the origins of my love of literature was sort of just this kind of a world in which fairies and fairy in the sense that Chesterton and MacDonald speak about it was present, was very charming to me. So
yeah, absolutely. I gotta say, I'm gonna go Greek, and I'm going with Icarus, because I just all of our principal fault is pride, and so much of what is destroying society and the world is when we think we can do it better than God. It's the Tower of Babel. It's the same type of idea. You're trying to get closer and higher, and our wings fall off. So yeah, I saw that, Kyron. You're right. You got the right answer. So you and me, you guys are all, second place. That's all right. But we can't all get the right answer. So I did great. Yeah.
I do want to give a shout out to some of the other great answers that we saw out there in the chat.
No, you said it first, Kyron. You didn't. I didn't steal your thunder. You said it first.
Yeah, Lord of the Rings and I used to know how to Ainulindale from the Silmarillion. That's the story of the singing into being of creation by the angelic class. That's a great one. I saw Till We Have Faces by Lewis somewhere here.
Oh, that's a phenomenal book.
Yeah. Let's see.
And we've got Paul Bunyan and the Blue Ox.
King Arthur. Yeah.
Love Paul Bunyan.
Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. So and then Irish legends. I mean, there's so many myths, and the point is that they all point us to these realities. We see the world around us, and then people have made up some stories to help explain it. And and there's truth. There's truth in there. There is truth. So so let's dive into the text. Great answers in the chat. And I want to talk about what is mythology, and I want to also point out that Chesterton answers his questions in a lot of different ways, doesn't he? Like throughout the chapter, he just keeps going and going and going. So we may not hit them all right at the beginning, but the first one that I found anyway was that it's a work of imagination and therefore a work of art. And so this is definitely a human thing. He's identifying it. If we look back to the first chapter, he's drawing a connection there, isn't he? That he's alluding back to the art, maybe the art in the cave.
He is. He's going back to that first art in the cave.
Right.
This chapter is very much, for me, it's very much a bridge. You can't read. It's very difficult to read this chapter as a standalone without having read the first chapter and it prefigures the final chapter of the book as well. So it's really important for everybody that's, that's following along every week to really go all the way to the end, but recall the first chapter here where he's recalling the cave paintings and the experts that are trying to tell us what those people were imagining.
Right. And missing the mark terribly.
Missing the
right?
mark terribly.
Right. And that's why he keeps saying in this chapter that we understand what these things are until somebody tries to tell us.
Yeah.
I love that.
And when people try to tell us, you're puncturing the mystery of it, and you're deflating the book, and it essentially goes away. So it's a matter of poetics, not anthropology, I guess.
Absolutely. It's sometimes the way we it's sometimes the way we overanalyze literature, right? Like, can't you destroy a good work of literature if you've got somebody who's just trying to get you to parse it down and treat it like some sort of scientific dissection? I think some of these things are meant to be savored and not analyzed. Sorry, Tom, I interrupted you.
No, I think that was a great statement, and it's
Yeah.
and we're thinking along the same lines that, he says right on page 163 that it's the unpoetical people that are the biggest critics of poetry, and my notes here say it's the same thing for architecture and art and criticism of the church by non-believers telling us what we're wrong about. The unpoetical.
My favorite is when non-parents are parenting experts. That one's really fun too. Everybody's a parenting expert till they get that first living, breathing, writing toddler. So that's lots of fun. So, okay. All right. Alan's going to come back because things are frozen up. So what about you, Joe? Did you have any other thoughts on what myth was according to Chesterton in this chapter?
Well, I do. I like that he calls it that he ties it to the poetic impulse. And he talks about how it's not dealing in abstractions, but it is finding, it's this natural drive to find wonder in things like the tree, the very particular. So that was a fascinating insight. And it reminded me personally very much of his description of orthodoxy when at the end of, I believe it's, I'm going to falsify. I think it's maybe at the end of Ethics of Elfland, where he goes through these fundamental facts that he discerned or discovered. And one of them is, he says, the world does not explain itself, and the world has meaning. And to have meaning, it must have someone to mean it. And whatever it means it furiously, right? Mm-hmm. And this idea, I think, is part of what he's driving at towards this sort of universal religion of man, which is in mythology that it comes up because of the fact that we search for that meaning. We see that there's something behind things like the structure of a snowflake or even of a tree or what have you. So, I thought that was just a really worthy insight that I wanted to draw out. And I'll just mention one other thing too, which is just to remind our friends, and I had to keep reminding myself, this is Chesterton starting to make good on that taxonomy that he laid out of the 4 categories that he's going to approach: God, the gods, the demons, and the philosophers. And now he's on the gods. And I did find it fascinating that one definition he gives right in the very first sentence, as it were, of the chapter, because he says what are called here the gods might almost be called the daydreams. So that's an interesting take for what it's worth.
Well, and I love the idea too that daydreams, where does a daydream originate? It originates within the self. So he's pointing out that these are something that comes within the human being as you encounter your environment and then you interpret it, right? Well, God is different than that, right? Like, God doesn't come from within the self. So that's one real important way that we distinguish between the gods and the God, right? There is this external God, and the gods aren't the God. It's so important. That's one of his main points. Gods are not the God, or an approximation of the God, or an evolution on the way to God.
Yes, he
something
makes it very
else.
clear that nobody prays to Thor.
Exactly. And you can't blaspheme Thor even if you try a really hard time. That was one of Dale's footnotes that was absolutely hilarious. You know, like you could
Yeah.
try all day and wear yourself out and you still won't be able to blaspheme Thor. You know, like I love when he uses hyperbole and his humor. It's awesome. So
He's very deliberate. Chesterton, through his writings in this book and in other books, takes people's stories as real. He takes the stories that people have told as real and different than myths in which they're trying to make sense of something that they can't understand. So, for example, San Siro, Saint Cyrus, is a particular patron of cultural debris excursions. San Siro was the 4th century bishop of Genoa, and he banished a basilisk from the well. Okay, and there are the painting in the apse in the Basilica of San Siro is of him banishing the basilisk. There is a 5th or 6th century marble plaque over the spot of the original well that's carved marble of San Siro with his mitre and crozier banishing the basilisk. And we've had guests on a trip to say, you can't believe this hokum. You guys are educated men. This is a myth. We said, no, it's not a myth. Myths try to make sense of something that we don't understand necessarily. Okay, this is not a story. It's a real thing that happened. So Chesterton to tell us that's a very good thing to believe.
Absolutely. Yeah. Absolutely. And that distinction is critical, and he is doing an amazing job of leading us along. And so the next question that Dale proposes for us is, what are myths not? So we talked a little bit about what myths are, and welcome back, Alan. I'm gonna maybe let you start and just let us know what are myths not. I think he's pretty plain.
Well, he tells us myths are not allegories, right? That's one of his explanations, and I think by and large myths, and this is also my surmising too, myths are not they're not simply an individual's fiction, I think, but they're bigger than that. If that makes sense, that it's not just a guy coming up with a story, right? But it's a myths are something that have to be embraced by community, I believe, and so there's sort of it. From I guess from a modern standpoint, we'd say there's kind of crowdsourced, right? So they're not subject to an individual's interpretation. There's not an individual who has ownership of a myth, I don't think.
Oh, I like that idea. So you're saying that there's sort of a communal thing that evolves within society, within relationships. So
yeah, I think so. I think
yeah.
so. I mean, it's not to say that the spark of something doesn't come. I mean, it has to start somewhere, but
Right.
but it's not simply an individual's idea. Now, you may have individuals who contribute to it. I mean, you might look at the Greek myths and say, well, Homer obviously contributed to that, but he didn't make them up, right? They pre-existed him. The stories of the gods and the heroes. So they're not. It's not something that an individual himself creates
Right.
out of whole cloth.
Because it could start with the daydream, but then as it enters society, it evolves into this myth, right? Because it has to start with the individual. Yeah. So I had a question up there. How are myths and allegories different? So he says myths are not allegories. I love this part. I just got to point this out because Chesterton sometimes just says it on the nose. I'm on page 183 at the bottom of Chesterton's text, and it says, he's talking about metaphors. We could talk about similes or allegories. And the metaphor of a shadow happens to hit very exactly the truth that is vital here. For a shadow is a shape, a thing which reproduces shape but not texture. These things were something like the real thing, and to say that they were like it is to say that they were different. Saying something is like a dog is another way of saying it is not a dog. And I think in a way, myth is not an allegory, because myth is actually true. It's true on a certain level. So
Right.
it's not saying something different than the truth. It's a truth.
Right.
It's this perception, and it's this interpretation of the world around us. So it's not truth with capital T, like divine revelation, but it's definitely true. I mean, that's my understanding. I could be wrong. So
No, I think
you
that's
know.
right. By the way, I just have to say that I was Dale's footnote on that on page 183, number 37, amused me a great deal.
Well, see, that's one of his peccadillos, is when people say like.
Yeah.
I've heard the lecture before. It's definitely something he is not amused. He would have been driven insane by Valley Girls, I'm pretty sure. So
No, I mean, going off of what you're saying about myths being true, I mean, to me, this is an element of myth. And I mean, obviously we understand that many of these myths that we're looking to are pagan myths. So they're discussing gods, of whether it's Egyptian gods or Nordic gods or Greek gods or whatever. So we understand that aspect of the divine is not real or not true. But I think an aspect of an enduring myth is what you're saying, is that it is capturing a truth, that it is a reflection. And Chesterton, I think, talks about this, that it is a reflection of man's searching for truth, that they're pointing the way, that here are these pagan cultures, but man's created for God, right? Man's created to find God and to serve God. And so there is that seeking out, and myths are an exploration of man's imagination in search of God and trying to find him.
Well, Chesterton also says somewhere in this chapter, I was just looking for the citation, can't find it, but where he says that Paul preached about the unknown God, right? To the Greeks, but really there's a sense in which you could say they were all unknown gods, right? And what I would draw as a distinction between allegory and myth is that in order to construct allegory, you need to know the referends, right? You need to know what is being referred to in order to then figure it allegorically into life, into your story, into your narrative. So, we've seen the Chronicles of Narnia get mentioned. I do think that the Chronicles of Narnia functions well as allegory and can be described as allegory, and it's precisely because Jesus, or Lewis at least knew Jesus, that he could make Aslan stand for Jesus, right? But the point about myths, especially some of these old myths, is they don't know. They don't know what it is that's behind the waterfall. There must be a spirit there, right? Because that's too magnificent simply to be material repetition or whatever. And so it's that searching after what is the meaning behind the waterfall. And that's, again, it can't be allegorical precisely because that's the question being asked. So myth asks, allegory answers, I would say.
So I'm gonna give you an assist here in the middle of page 178. St. Paul said that the Greeks had one altar to an unknown God, but in truth, all their gods were unknown gods. And the real break in history did come when St. Paul declared to them whom they had ignorantly worshipped.
Yeah.
So, that's a signal point there. He's saying this is a break in history. Something changed with Jesus Christ, with the preaching of the gospel. This is we're in a new epoch, and he reiterates that throughout. Like you said, there's a theme. We're going from the first chapter. This is a signal chapter, but he's definitely pointing out that Christ is splitting time and soon. With the incarnation comes a whole new ballgame, and the world, Go ahead,
I
Tom.
think maybe the more important sentence to me,
Okay.
what hit me harder, the one that I underlined in a harder hand and put a star next to, was that he was talking about the pagan, and Chesterton is explaining the pagan to himself, essentially saying that the pagan doesn't disbelieve like an atheist any more than he believes like a Christian. He feels the presence of powers about which he only guesses and invents. And then jumps back to page 185 where he says, I do not mean merely that I myself believe that one is true and the other is not. It was that one was never meant to be true in the same sense as the other. Okay. And this is what people understand. I think the difference between when you read Herodotus and you read about all these weird things that he supposedly saw, I don't think many people believe that actually. Okay. They don't, because they just don't believe that. But today when somebody says, no, St. George didn't actually destroy a dragon, we go, oh, absolutely. I do think that he did destroy dragons, because we see dragons around us. Have you ever seen a video of a Komodo dragon taking out a goat? It's scary. Okay. And have you ever seen crocodiles eating wildebeests? Yeah. Okay. Those are real things.
Even my chickens. I mean, they're definitely little dinosaurs.
They're little dinosaurs.
They're definitely.
I want to talk about that epoch changing idea, because there, with the advent of Christ, and the proclamation of him that Chesterton points to here with Paul confronting the Athenians, we can't. Two things. One, we can't understand the myths as, at least the old pagan myths, as the originators and communities understood them, because we already know about Jesus. And we also can't. So we see a lot of people today trying to go back to being pagan, right? So they're, I'm going to reject Christianity and I'm going to, march around Stonehenge or become or worship Odin or whatever. But that door is also shut to us, because we can't unring that bell. We can't make the cross not happen. It's happened. So we can't go back to those things which were always, in a sense, pointing forward to the ultimate understanding of the universe, which is in Jesus. You can't go back to that. Now we can look back and we can learn some things from them. I mean, I think that the old myths are very valuable and we all love them, but we still don't have things have been revealed to us that we already know. We already know the spoilers on these things,
right? And
we can't go back on those things. And so there is a sense in which those old pre-Christian myths are, I guess the riddle of those has been solved in a way that the people who originated them or who lived with them never knew.
And in a way, I feel like they'll never satisfy, right? So it's like, I've searched all my life for some amazing chocolate, and I find this, I go to France and I'm walking down this rue and I find this like beautiful chocolatier and I taste this amazing truffle and it's amazing and it's wonderful. And then I have that memory, and then I come back to the States and all I got is Tootsie Rolls, like I'm never going to be satisfied until I get back over to France and I get that real chocolate,
Once the girl goes to the big city,
it's all over, man, and Jesus Christ fulfilled all the desires of our heart. He is the everlasting man. And so if we've had a taste of that, you know, and our culture, you know, even though we're heading towards post-Christian, we know there's something. That's why people keep looking. There's a lot of angst, there's a lot of anxiety for folks who haven't you know, come into that sort of a relationship, because they're never going to, our hearts are restless until they rest in him, because he's the authentic, he is the truth, you know. And once you've had a taste of that, it's all over. You know, I want to go to the chat, and I want to pull up a few questions, and maybe we can whip through some of those real quick. First, is the Odyssey an allegory? I think it's a myth. That's my thought. What do you guys think?
It's too much for a single allegory.
Yeah, there's a lot going on there.
So there was the Man Who Is Thursday is an allegory for the Book of Job. The Odyssey is a series of it's a mythology because it's a series of truths. Okay, it's a series of truths that are told in the form of a story.
Okay.
I don't know, Alan or Joe.
You want to chime in on that?
I think that's right. I mean, going as Joe said this earlier, there has to be a reference, right? There has to be something that an allegory is referring to. So what's it referring to? And it has to be a known thing.
Right.
Or it can't work as an allegory. An allegory has to be a representation of a thing that is known. In those, the myths are representations specifically of things that were not known. They were man's imagination seeking to explain what he doesn't know. And in the best instances, those were things that would lead him ultimately to God, to the true God of heaven, and ultimately Jesus Christ. But those are things, but we couldn't know those things through imagination, because those are things that could only be revealed. Jesus couldn't be known through reason or imagination. He could only be known through revelation, because it was a mystery. God's plan was a mystery that on which angels longed to look, right? Even angels didn't know the mystery. So a mystery is, the definition of a mystery in a biblical sense is not simply something that isn't known, and something that cannot be known unless it's revealed, unless it's given to us by revelation. So those things can't be allegories in the sense that we're talking about. Now, you might say something like Narnia or something like Lord of the Rings, although don't tell Tolkien Lord of the Rings might be an allegory, because he didn't like that idea. But those things could be allegories because they're referring to something, or they're referencing something we know and we understand already. I don't know. I hope that distinction makes sense.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I think these are good things to struggle with too. So as we approach these definitions, and we, it's an iterative process. So I've read this book over and over, and I get deeper into my understanding every time. And I'm a different person every time I read it. So I think it's okay that some of these things are in process. Steve asks us, C.S. Lewis's reading of T.E.M., The Everlasting Man, was key for him, but he still had problems with the mythological question until he spoke with Tolkien. How do you think today's chapter compares to Tolkien's arguments?
Well,
I'm not a Tolkien scholar, so I'm tapping out.
Well, we don't know 100% really what Tolkien's arguments were. As much has been made over this, it's the famous Addison's Walk excursion that Lewis and Tolkien took together with Hugo Dyson. And our primary source for this is 2 letters that Lewis writes to his friend Arthur Greaves, and he gives us a little bit of detail as to what Tolkien and Dyson said, but we don't have a whole lot there. I would like to think that some of it arose precisely by Lewis remembering the seeds that were planted by this chapter, because the whole conclusion of that Christianity is the true fact. It's the moment when myth becomes fact. So the true myth, when myth becomes fact, I think that is probably the source of what was going on in that conversation, in all likelihood. And Tolkien was, he was the person there. It is one of my Steve. I love the thought experiment of imagining what would have happened had Lewis and Chesterton met in the flesh, but we'll never know. But thanks, good question.
Yeah, absolutely. All right. So I hid that. Let's see. Okay, myth is a narrative built on a framework of deeper truth or truths that connect to the soul, is it not?
Yes.
Yeah, I think so.
Okay.
And well, let me chase
I
that too,
agree.
Susan, just for
Okay.
on
Yeah,
one point,
absolutely.
which is this allegory thing, because I think that I
Yeah.
personally don't get too precious about these distinctions.
I-
Mhm.
Professor Tolkien did, for example. He
He
would,
did. He very much did.
yeah, he did, and I think there's a large span of difference between allegory and allegorical. The allegorical imagination is kind of in all fiction. It's impossible to, when you're coming across any simile or metaphor in prose, that the even phrases like stiff upper lip or whatever it happens to be, there's an allegorical imagination, or at least a symbolic imagination. This is, and that goes right down to the level of language. So I don't get too picky about it. Allegories or myths. I would just say technically, allegorical fiction is that which symbolizes something else, and what is symbolized is known. It's not just directing towards a vague something that's there.
And if you
Okay.
build a series of allegories, I wouldn't get too hung up on a series of allegories could become a myth. Okay. I mean, I don't have
Right.
any problem with that at all.
Right.
Yeah.
And it's okay. Chesterton said they're not allegories, but Chesterton, I mean, this isn't also divine revelation. So, I mean, if we disagree a little with our patron, or we have some nuanced understanding of it, I think that's all right. So this is for you, Tom, because you brought it up. The man who was Thursday is an allegory for Job. How so? You have like 1 minute because we got to get back to the chapter.
Well,
but
I would
it
just
deserves
ask you to talk to Dale about that and go to the Pints with Chesterton podcasts where the gals
Yes.
talk to Dale about that very, very topic. They
Absolutely.
went in great detail over the book of Job and Dale's
Yes.
reading of it as an allegory for the book, or sorry, for the
I feel
man who
like
was
this is the
Thursday.
moment where Dale's supposed to descend from the ceiling
Deus ex machina.
and explain
Anyway.
it.
and hold forth. No, Pints with Chesterton, absolutely. By the way, they're going to be on the Everlasting Man book club soon, so stay tuned for that. They're phenomenal, and they did do a great job of explaining that. So
Yeah, I think they're a lot more fun than Tom and me, but
yeah, well, that may be. I don't know. Maybe our back end folks could find that link to the Pints with Chesterton episode. I know that's a lot, so stay tuned in the chat, or maybe one of our folks out there can find it and put the link to their podcast in the chat. So I want to
think we're
move
fine.
on. Yeah, what's that?
Nothing. I said I think we're fine.
You think?
well, I didn't say
I
we
think
weren't
you're
fun.
great. I
didn't
mean,
say we weren't
honestly,
fun.
all of our special guests are phenomenal. You're just as special as everybody else. You really are. And
You're you're the evil villain in The Incredibles. When everybody's special, nobody's special.
oh yeah, definitely. And when everything is true, nothing is true. So here we go. Let's
So everything is everything.
yeah, everything is everything, but then everything's nothing. So Chesterton seems to suggest that there is some sort of universal understanding of myth, possibly something along the lines of the Tao from Lewis's Abolition of Man. Do you agree? So the Tao, we're approaching sort of natural law, or some sort of like understanding that people can ascertain just from like observing nature. Some things that are cross-cultural, Do you think?
I want to not answer that question by saying something else that's kind of related to it, but the idea of the universal, and I think that this does touch on something that Chesterton brings out, which he talks about essentially the localism of myths. Myths are tied to a place. So if the Greek myths are Greek myths, he talks about Apollo's not just up in any sky, right? And that all of these different ideas. I mean, take my Arthurian legends. I mean, Arthur has to be in England, right? That's where he has to be for it to work. Pecos Bill has to be in Texas. Paul Bunyan has to be out west chopping down trees. So the myths to work have to be placed somewhere. And even the true myth, as Lewis called it, the true myth of Jesus, he's located somewhere. He's on a cross in Golgotha. That there's a place, there's a people that he comes from. And so all of these, I do think, yes, myths are seeking to explain something universal, but they have to do it from a locality. They have to do it from a specific place in order to reach the universal. The particular is the only window into the universal. That's my diatribe there.
And that
love
has everything to do with the Tao. It really does, because the Tao is trying to talk about something that's universal, and there are very, very few. Like the Tao is so almost unexplainable to people that when you try to say what is this? It's this universal thing. What is that? Is that God? No, it's not God, but it's universal. Okay. We do have something that is universal, and that's what Chesterton was talking about. And that's what he's talking about in this book. We have a single universal thing. That's God, and he's made manifest in Jesus Christ.
Absolutely.
We have on our cultural debris excursions, there's a reading that we assign readings. People can or cannot read them, but we have readings that people can choose to read if they want to.
They do.
One of those is an essay by an Irish poet named Patrick Kavanagh called the Parish and the Universe. And it's a fairly short essay, but he's talking about just that idea that the local, reading the local paper. He talks about reading the local paper, the county paper, who's died, what land transactions have happened, and so forth. That is the window into the universal. But it's a particularity that is confident in itself. It's not a particularity. It's not something that's having to look to the big city for approval, but it's sure of itself. It's its own thing. It has self-confidence. So when the Greeks became, were off conquering and becoming great, and the Romans too, it was because they were acting out of this self-confidence, and they had the self-confidence that flowed over into the myths as well. So I think that we always have to think of myths in terms of the local and the particular first, and understand the context of them. But through that, we get to the universal principle that all of them are seeking. All myths are seeking something universal, I think, but they have to do it in that out of that context.
Right, because I think that points to sort of the incarnational nature of human beings. Like, we exist in a time and place, as does Jesus Christ.
Yes, exactly.
He's not just an abstract concept. He's a man who lived in a particular time. He was born to a particular woman and died in a particular way, and had, and that brings things to reality too. Like, it's important.
It's the embodiment, the incarnation, and accepting that. Again, what Lewis calls the true myth of Jesus. Accepting that is a struggle for a lot of even people who identify themselves as Christians sometimes, that they really struggle with the idea of the incarnation, of the full ramifications of that, because there's always the desire to try to make things abstract, and there's a desire to make God abstract, but God chose the opposite of making himself abstract. He made himself particular.
Right.
And so Jesus was, as you said, was born of a particular woman in a particular place in a particular time, and he died
in a particular way. Oh, we're having trouble tonight with our guests. I know exactly what Alan was going to say. And so it's just you and me, Joe. We're going to talk about, I'm going to ask a question and then I'm going to answer it right away. And then we're going to talk about it. Oh, and you're back, Alan.
I'm back.
You want to finish up what you were going to say? Yeah, that's awesome.
Okay.
I'm so glad you're back. I missed you.
Sure. You can't lose both of us at once.
No, I'm like, oh.
No, I mean, you see this a lot, and I'm not meaning to sling mud at anybody, but you see this a lot, this desire to make Christianity abstract, or the moral principles abstract, but they can't work unless Jesus is Jesus. Christians are necessarily tied to the man Jesus Christ. And if you pull the man Jesus Christ out of the equation, Christianity falls apart. It doesn't exist. It can't exist. And so there has to be that particularity. And it's something that we have to embrace in understanding the mythological nature of the gospel story.
Yes. Yeah. I couldn't say it better than that.
I see. Where somebody posted, they're dropping like flies. So
they're dropping like flies.
We're having a hard time pumping the internet into Kentucky today.
At least, we are just lighting the internet on fire, and I'm just telling you that, I think that sometimes these technical difficulties arise when somebody doesn't want things to be said, and I think that we're just going to say them anyway. So. Right. Here you go. I want to ask this question. This is what I'm going to do. I'm going to ask this question, then I'm going to answer it, then we're going to talk about it. I'm going to ask it. I'm going to tell you what Chesterton said, and then I want to talk about it because I think this is really important. What is one of the most natural things for man to do? It's on page 180. This is the beginning of the first full paragraph on page 180. He says, the crux and the crisis is that man found it natural to worship, even natural to worship unnatural things. The posture of the idol might be stiff and strange, but the gesture of the worshiper was generous and beautiful. So what does that mean for mankind? And what does that mean, for the world? We're pointing to the incarnation, right? He's saying, I've started with the cave and we're headed somewhere. Why is it this important? And why is Chesterton pointing out that it's natural for man to worship?
I think that goes back to the entire idea of why, which I mentioned earlier, the idea of why man was created, right? Man is created to seek and find God. The letter to the Hebrews tells us that we are meant to seek and find him. And of course, Jesus has told us exactly that if we seek, we will find him, right? That's one of the promises that Jesus gave us. But for mankind as a whole, that was a centuries long process. I mean, that applies now because Jesus has come. That applies now to our own lives, our own individual lives. But for centuries, it was the process of mankind to seek out God. And so I think we do have to be kind, I guess we'll say, to pagan cultures before Christ, because even though they were wrong, right? Scripture tells us the times of ignorance God winked at, right? As the old translation says. But now calls all men everywhere to repent. So there was a time in which mankind as a whole, in all of their little particular ways, were trying to find God and seek him out. And their manifestations of those things, as Chesterton says, may be idle, may be just stiff. And that's all they could be.
Right.
Because they couldn't be anything else. But man is himself created by the divine for the divine. So he is man was always better than the gods he created, because we ourselves were, we had God, the creator God. We were in the image of the creator.
We've always been in the image of God.
Right.
So we've always had this sort of like, we're more than our daydreams, right?
Correct.
We're more than
Yes.
the myths that we create, right?
Yes.
That's just one part of our imagination. I love that. That is a beautiful insight. And Chesterton says too, that if a man cannot pray, he is gagged. If he cannot kneel, he is in irons. What does that mean? And in what way does an inability to worship enslave us? I love this. I love this idea that this is almost like a function that we have to do. Like, if we don't do this, I think it's going to consume us, and I think we see this in our culture. I think we see people who, they can't pray, they can't give gratitude to something greater than themselves, and they end up in despair. If there's nothing more than this, and you have a bad day and somebody cuts you off in traffic, and your job is less than satisfying, and people are unkind to you at the grocery store. I mean, it'd be easy to tumble into despair if there was nothing more, or if you couldn't look with the eyes of faith at a beautiful sunrise, which happens every day. Your turn, Tom.
Chesterton says, praying
But
boy may be said to express, maybe said rather than to satisfy it. Praying boy expresses that need, and it doesn't matter where you are in the world. People, humans, created humans, recognize that there cannot be something, okay, and that there had to be something that created the something. And that's what they seek. It's innate in our humanity to seek our creator.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I want to go to a question that I saw somewhere in the chat, and I've lost it now, but it was talking about this idea of faith and reason, and how they support one another. And I think you touched on that. And I want to go just a little bit deeper when we're talking about nature, our observations of it, and then divine truth, how that and the church brought it together. That's the pull quote, right? That Dale chose at the beginning of the chapter. The truth is that the church was actually the first thing that ever tried to combine reason and religion. So it's an important point, and I'm really glad that that question was asked.
It is an important point, and Chesterton points out that modern scientists, or materialists, as he says, criticize the church for not embracing reason, right? But he said, no, the church actually were the first to do that. The pagans in creating myth weren't embracing reason. It was an imaginative expression. That's not a criticism of it. That's just what it was. But it was the church. And one of the things that Chesterton didn't go into depth on this, but he talked about it a little bit. But what I thought was, you look at, he says, the myths are not a religion like Christianity or even Islam. And one of the things that, there's not a creed. There's no one standing up saying, I believe in Zeus, I believe in Apollo, right? There's no theology really in these myths, right? I mean, that's they explain certain things, but we don't have a summa of Zeus, right? That's applying reason where the pagan myths did not. They were expressing a story to tell something about it. Scripture does that too. They're true stories, but they're also doing that. But then reason is applied to that, and you have to have both of those in order for it to be fully the religion that we know. And so the church, I mean, Western civilization doesn't exist without the church. And science
and reason doesn't either.
Right. Yeah. Yes.
Right. So
Well, I
science and
think
reason don't exist without the church. It's very interesting in that these people that try to tell us that we're not being reasonable, they think that science is an answer. Science is not an answer. Science is a process of achieving answers. And there are some things that science can't answer, or that the scientists, sorry, haven't yet been able to answer, such as why do we love? Okay. Reason and faith can tell us what science hasn't been able to yet. And the church recognizes that. Joe, I'm sorry if I cut you off, my friend.
no, not at all. I just wanted to say to Dave there with that question too. I think that part of the purpose of that being Dale's pull quote, is probably to help us track with the broader argument of the book too. So if you kind of pay attention to what Chesterton's doing here and this sort of double helix thing that he's structuring together. Yes, David. Thank you, Nancy. So this idea is going to basically trace that, well, religion or yeah, faith without reason, right? The pagan mythologies and so forth, they become a mockery of themselves because nobody's taking them seriously. But then something steps in and fills that void, right? If man is searching for a supernatural power to worship, but he's left to his own imagination and it's a perverse imagination, well, guess what? There are beings that are going to come in and say, "Hey, worship me," and they do. And we're getting there. And then philosophy, on the other hand, without faith, breaks into philosophy and all the modern philosophies that become an attack upon reason themselves. So this is this brilliant kind of history of ideas that Chesterton is tracing here. So I just encourage you to follow that thread through and see how this connects. Why this discussion of the mythologies, because it sounds like he's being very, very positive for the most part towards pagan mythologies. They'll come in for criticism in the long run eventually, to the extent that they needed what Christianity is the answer for.
Absolutely. So I want to point out that our friend Guillermo over in Ireland, thank you. You're here in the middle of the night. That is dedication. Reason without faith leads to nihilism, and faith without reason leads to superstition. Beautiful thought. We do have a question about Islam in the comments. I'm gonna leave that for next time because we're getting close to the end, or leave that for later. He does address Islam in more depth, so I don't want to give it short shrift because we're coming up on the hour. So I really want to, thank our guests for being here. And these book clubs go all too quickly. I think an hour. I want to be. I want to be Matt Fradd, except not a man, and have a little bit longer to spend with you. Would be amazing, but I'm not. So we've got to say goodnight, and I've got a few announcements that I need to make. I want to let you know that we are going to be off next week. All right. But you are going to have to come back because Joe and I are going to be at the Chesterton Schools Network Conference, which is going to be a lot of fun. And we will not be able to be here. But I want somebody to put up the overlay for Jeff if we've got that, so you can see him. He was actually instrumental in my conversion. And so I'm super honored that he's going to be here as a guest. He's got an amazing blog at the Kurt Jester. And even though he was instrumental in my conversion, I did not meet him until about 16 years later at a Chesterton conference. By Providence. So that is amazing. I want to remind you, that discussions are recorded and accessible. You do have a playlist. If your friends want to watch them though, please have them sign up. We just want to have them join us. There is, they can sign up using that, or they can go to chesterton.org/everlastingman. It's never too late. And then they will have access to that playlist. So they can catch up when they're exercising or doing their dishes or laundry. Conference registration is available. We are going to be at the conference. I think everybody's going to be at the conference here, right? It's going to be amazing. So if you would like to hear more amazing discussions, if you would like to be a part of that discussion, join us in Philadelphia If you can't make it, we will be sad to miss you, but you can also sign up for the virtual conference, which means you get access to every single one of the talks for, I think, an entire year. It's going to be amazing. And those will be available on an app we have called Huva. There's also discussions on there. You can earn points. Some people are crazy about the points, so you might want to join us there. Whether you sign up in person or online, you can join us on Huva. And as always, you know, nights are the heartbeat of the apostolate. When people sign up to support us monthly, that means that we can continue to do innovative things. We can find the resources to be able to do things like this book club. You know, and we ultimately, our goal is to point people towards the everlasting man. So, you know, if the society's helped you and you're interested in supporting us, we would love to have you partner with us to bring content like this to other people. So I just want to say thank you so much, Tom and Alan, for joining us. Thank you, Joe, for being an amazing co-host. And I want to tell everybody in the audience that Chesterton is always better with friends.
Thank you all.
Good night.